Well, I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail tomorrow, but for most people in the West, certainly in America, we tend to use sin as a basket term, and we throw everything in the basket. But to the Hebrew way of thinking, there are different types of what we would term sin. So again, I'll go into this in more detail tomorrow. I'm just trying to give a high-level introduction here. But what we call sin is really when you do wrong not knowing you're doing wrong. So we could call it, sinning by accident. And then there's transgression, which is more serious because you know darn well what you're doing and you go ahead and do it anyway. And then there's iniquity, which is what is in your genetics or your bloodstream, and it's passed to you from those upstream from you, your ancestors, but it continues to have lingering and durable effects in the now. So if we pick up those three concepts, it's probably true that most people who are abusing their children and that sort of thing are aware that they're doing something wrong. I think that's pretty well understood. But if we think about everything that we've just heard about, what's happening is it's starting to create change in the biochemical structure of the human body. So we have the physical impacting the spiritual, and the durable spiritual effects as this passes on from generation to generation. And probably the best way to really articulate this is, I'm going to name two genocides, not one. Of course, the whipping boy and the one that everybody would know would be the Nazi Holocaust. And there have been studies that have been conducted of what's happened now. It's actually the grandchildren of the survivors of the Holocaust. 20 years ago it would have been only the children of the survivors. But what they're seeing is that in the grandchildren of the Holocaust, they have an above normal incidence of things like anxiety disorder, depression, sleep disorder, irritability, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all coming out of what happened to their grandparents. And scientifically what's going on is there's a chemical marker that gets tagged onto the DNA. It's known as methylation. It's a methyl molecule. So the methylation of the DNA, it actually creates it's not a full mutation because it doesn't change the base sequence, but it alters the way the DNA, and with that the RNA, interacts with the normal chemical processes in the cell. So this is where science and spirituality actually, so there isn't actually a contradiction between science and religion. It's just, we've been thinking in two separate spheres and not talking to each other. Anyway, so, they've tracked this, and they've actually done some more recent studies using fruit flies, which is interesting because for fruit flies we don't think of them as being higher forms of intelligence.
No, we do not. No.
But what they've been able to do is, because fruit flies breed rapidly, they're good for studying genetics. That's why, going way back to probably when we were all studying, basic biology in high school, they were talking about fruit fly studies. But what they've been able to do is they've been able to do fruit fly studies on this issue of methylation. And what they found is that they can prove statistically that there's a higher than normal incidence of these kinds of abnormalities. Again, allowing that it's fruit flies, not humans, but just stay with me for a moment. They've been able to prove the effect for 14 generations.
Wow.
14 generations. So it depends how you define a generation. At 30 years, that would be 420 years for human life cycles. If it were 40 years, well, then the number goes up to 560 years, or more than half a millennium. And so as we think about this, we can realize what's happening, again, speaking specifically of our current crisis, is seeds of destruction are being sown into our entire population base. Mm-hmm. The effect of which will be, continuing to resonate for centuries if this doesn't get cleaned up. And the good news is, in Jesus, we have an answer.
Amen.
We can actually fix this. But the bad news is, most people aren't aware of it, and many people would reject it out of hand because it's Christian and they don't like Christianity.
I'll just say that over the last 7 years, as I've had the privilege and experience of learning how to bring healing prayer to people who carry trauma, all sorts of trauma, one of the things that I encountered was meeting people who lined up with all of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or unresolved trauma, but they could not remember a specific event where they had been traumatized, or they just couldn't, they, as far as they knew, their life had really been a pretty good life, but they still carried a lot of those symptoms. Of course, the first place you go is maybe it's a blocked memory, where you have people where they can't remember their lives, you know, before the age of 10 or 6 or something like that, which is a pretty good indicator that there's significant childhood trauma that's happening there. But then, you know, the more people you pray with, the more people you talk to, the more you find out this segment of people who really honestly don't have anything in their own personal experience that we would call traumatic or that would elicit those kind of responses. So as you begin to interview them and you find out about past family history, you find fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers who were in military in World War II, World War I, some in Vietnam, other things like that. You find others who have histories of severe poverty, severe, whether it be the Depression or just living an entire life where food was a scarcity. You find other traumatic incidents that go back to things that happen within people groups. So for instance, there's a Native American piece that's huge in regards to carrying the kind of generational trauma that happened to the Native Americans, particularly here in the United States, or other indigenous people groups throughout the world where have experienced either dislocation from their tribal homes or other kinds of genocide that's taken place. So as I've done in this entire ministry, first of all, I only got into this because the Holy Spirit led me into it. And what I would do is I would pray what the Holy Spirit would lead me to do, and then I would go into secular trauma research or into neuroscience research and find out, okay, is that a thing? And then I would find out, wow, the Holy Spirit is a great expert. He really knows what he's doing, you know? So I would say, okay, I can stick with that, right?
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
That was the best one of the night.
I told you were going to laugh. So anyway, I just began going after it. And then one of the things by Dr. Peter Levine in his book, Trauma and Memory, he had a chapter on generational trauma. And as he began to just open that up for me, particularly the study with the mice and the cherry blossom scent and all of that stuff, it began to make a lot of sense, at least under the Holy Spirit, that this is something that is real to these people. They're experiencing the symptoms, they just don't know where it comes from. So as you begin to understand both through the breaking of those generational things that have attached to them, and I like what Ken says, that many times, whether it be demonic spirits or just tendencies, they attach to bad things that have happened even in past generations. So, for instance, I'll talk about this again tomorrow, but I found out from my father's family why nobody ever talked about the 13 children, of which my grandfather was the youngest, and why the other 12 never had any children. Well, I found out that there's a whole history of suicide, of alcoholism, of insanity that ran right up my father's line. And my grandfather was the only one that had 3 children, and he died as an alcoholic in an institution in 1933 in Central City, Kentucky. So there was it began to open up for me why I went through what I went through as a child, why I had monsters appearing in my room and tormenting me, and the thoughts of suicide that I had at 7 and 8 years of age, and the feeling like I was going crazy. It all began to connect for me personally, and I'll tell more about that later tomorrow, but significantly it began to help me understand how somebody who generally had a pretty trauma-free life could still carry all of this symptomology. Mm-hmm. And so it makes perfect sense that this is generational trauma, the effects of which are passed down both through the genetics, which is called epigenetics, but it's also passed down through the behaviors and the traditions and through the emotional either explosions or the emotional deadness that takes place within family systems, so that you see this entire history of very dysfunctional family behaviors that you just think is normal. You think, well, this is the way everybody lives life, and then finally when you get out there you find out, no, there's nothing normal about what you've been through, what you experienced as a family.